folks. Welcome to session 5 of Love, Joy, Peace, our introduction to Christian spirituality. Great to have you with us if you're joining us. My name's Tim, I'm sure you know. I'm the vicar here at St Paul's, and I hope it's going to be peaceful enough and quiet enough here in St Paul's this evening. I'm here by myself with everything plugged in. But the fireworks are banging and crashing loud around us, so if you do hear any untoward pops and bangs coming through your devices to you this evening, it's almost certainly a firework going off somewhere nearby. I don't know if you're having fireworks this evening or at any point during this time. I guess we can't go to public displays, can we? So yeah, we had a few in the garden just earlier with the kids. It was lovely. Anyway, so this is our final session together this evening, and we're going to think a little bit about the place communion has in Christian spirituality, or what it represents. For those of you, if you're watching, who are have been Christians for a long time, perhaps an opportunity to re-examine what communion means to you, why we share bread and wine together, and we're going to look at really how it represents the acceptance of an invitation. The acceptance of an invitation. I'm going to have a couple of meditations again, guided meditations this week together. So hopefully you're somewhere where you can enjoy those and relax into them and to feel calm and quiet around you. I do hope that is the case. I'm going to have a little bit of couple of passages from the Bible as well that speak of the invitation that God speaks to us. And I suppose you could say a little bit about the idea of God speaking to us as well. If you may remember last week we thought a little bit about silence, so you could say this week we're thinking a little bit about speaking instead. So what I want to do just before we go into our first reflection or meditation is just to think a little bit about what we've done so far, recap a little bit of what the main themes, I suppose, of these 5 sessions have been. So I'm sure you remember, if you cast your mind back, in session 1, in week 1, we encountered, I think, one of the most profound changes that it's possible to encounter, really, in the way that we think about the world, which is this idea, which of course is central to Christian spirituality, which is that there is another, that by acknowledging the very idea of the existence of God, a defined God, a personal God, a loving God, that means that we as individuals kind of cease to be the centre of the universe, if you see what I mean. Kind of cease to be the centre of our worlds, and that we look outwards rather than inwards. We look outwards to a loving and personal God who knows us and who loves us. And that is a huge change in the way you view the world, I have to say. I can't imagine a more fundamental one. And it's a powerful one as well. This decentering of ourselves, you see, opens us up to understanding that we are loved and cherished by another, and by God, who we've kind of described as the perfect parent that none of us have ever known. If that's a useful thing to think about God as. So that was week 1. In week 2, we looked at some of the things, we considered the journey, I suppose, that we've been on, and discovered that Christian spirituality is again about the idea of journeying on into what we call redemption, which is the idea of healing and restoration that doesn't rub out the things and the twists and turns of our stories, but rather makes them part of something beautiful. And we imagined the destination of this journey as being a place full of or connected with love, joy and peace, hence the name of the course. Then in week 3 we looked at some of the things that hold us back as we go on that journey, which brought the idea of forgiveness into the frame, something which again is really central to Christian spirituality. Then in week 4, last week, we considered, as I say, the place of silence. Silence is actually a really powerful part of spirituality for a lot of people. And we looked towards really how silence is connected in Christian spirituality with the cross, or the way that Jesus died, and therefore the fact that silence is now a safe place for Christians, if you will. We discovered how the cross is God's answer to the unanswerable questions that we have, and how it means that we never have to fear silence or solitude, that God is always with us. Another really central part of Christian spirituality. So if I was to try and find a way of summing up those 4 weeks in a word, to be honest, it would be that word, invitation. And we've discovered, I hope, how Christian spirituality is about accepting God's invitation to journey to a place of healing and freedom, a place of love, joy and peace. That's the idea. So in week 5, as I say, we're going to consider the place that what we call Holy Communion or communion has in Christian spirituality. Holy Communion is a shared meal, or at least a symbolic shared meal. I've got a silver cup here with a tiny bit of wine in it, and a small piece of bread, wafer bread there. In the early days of the Christian faith, this shared meal wasn't symbolic, it was an actual meal. And it often forms part of Christian worship, this shared meal. It's often referred to simply as communion, and in some formal settings it's referred to by the Greek word for thanksgiving, the old-fashioned Greek word, which is Eucharist, a word you may have heard Christians talk about. So Christians have been celebrating this shared meal during their worship for nearly 2,000 years, and it is absolutely, for many people, central to their spirituality. So we're going to explore that and look at why, if you will, why it's got such an important place, this shared meal, why it has such an important place in our spirituality. So we're going to journey through that, but I want to start really today as an opening reflection by asking you to think about a question. And the question is this: what is the biggest or the best invitation that you have ever received? What's the biggest or best invitation that you've ever received? And I want to invite you just to think about that for a couple of moments. I'll just put a little bit of background music on. Just think about it. Just cast your mind back through your story. What is the biggest or the best invitation that you've ever, the most exciting invitation that you've ever received? Let's just think about that. So I wonder what came to your mind. What's the best or biggest or most exciting invitation you've received? Was it, I don't know, a wedding in a fancy hotel or a country house, something like that? Maybe to attend an award ceremony or investiture, something like that. Has anyone ever been invited here to Buckingham Palace, I wonder? Has anyone ever been invited to tread a red carpet or meet someone famous at an award ceremony? Don't know. Maybe you have, maybe you haven't. Or perhaps even we can think about other invitations. Invitations to go out and meet with someone who perhaps one of those times in life where you get to go out and meet with someone who makes your heart beat a little bit faster, whoever and whenever that was. I wonder who that was for you. Very quickly I'll share a silly story really of a great invitation that I received once, me and Helen, which is that we won a competition through I think it was very mundane really, in the sense that it was through our phone providers, through Vodafone. I think we won a draw with them, which was to visit the McLaren Racing Car Centre, whatever it was called, McLaren Technology Centre, where they build their racing cars, their Formula 1 cars and so on and so forth. And Vodafone, I think, sponsored them at the time. But anyway, we went down there and it was a big do, and there was a couple of hundred people who'd all won this competition. But we got to meet Lewis Hamilton from a distance, saw him drive his racing car, got to sit in all the different racing cars, even changed the wheel on a Formula One car, all over canapes and drinks. So a very civilised way of spending some time. Great fun at the time. So that was a fun invitation, but I wonder, some of you may have experienced some great invitations yourself. Now, if we were meeting in person, this would be a great time to share some stories. I won't ask you to type any in, but if I do see any good comments appear, I would let you know what they were. But if we were meeting in person, we'd share some stories, I think, now. But what I want to do, as we just move on from that question, we'll leave that one hanging in the air, really, is to start thinking about what it is that God is inviting us to do, or inviting us to hear as God speaks. Which raises the idea about God speaking to us. So I'll just say a little bit about that. Christians often talk about the idea of God speaking to us. The idea that God can and does communicate with us is another important part of Christian spirituality, and is important this week as we think about what communion represents. It's been an experience for 2,000 years for Christians that God can speak to us. But however, mostly when Christians talk about these things, in my experience, they don't usually mean that they heard a voice speak to them or something like that, I have to be honest. Rather, they mean that they feel some words were given to them almost from the outside, almost impressed upon their mind, or something like that. But always, as we talked about in week 1 and 2, always words that brought comfort and life, that brought them further along that road of redemption. Maybe surprising words, but always words of comfort and joy and life. Words that are the sort of thing that perfect parent might say. As we think about invitation, what we're doing really, I think, is we're summing up the sort of things, I think, that God says to us, that God wishes, perhaps you could say, to speak to us all. What is it that God wishes to speak to us all? Well, I think it's an invitation, as I've said, an invitation, and actually a spectacularly big invitation, an invitation bigger than any we may have received before. And really there's something important there for us to dig into a little bit. And I want to just look at a couple of bits of the Bible today where God speaks and where someone hears an invitation that is so much bigger than they've ever imagined and so much bigger than they've thought before. And this is connected with communion, as we will see. So we're going to think about a Bible story, a story from one of the 4 stories of the life of Jesus, or the Gospel of Luke in this case. And as last week, as we considered the death of Jesus on the cross, this year we're going to look at a story, this session I should say, we're going to consider one of the stories of Jesus' resurrection as he came back to life by the power of God, as Christians believe, and encountered some of his followers again. So the first story we're going to read, and I'm going to read you a bit of the story from the Bible first, explain a little bit of the context, and then we're going to do a meditation based upon it. The first one is called The Road to Emmaus, a very famous story which I think you may know if you've been around churches before. Emmaus was a place, and it's simply an encounter between the resurrected Jesus and some of his friends, some of his followers, on a road to a town called Emmaus. And like I say, it is important to have a little bit look at sort of the context of that. So I'm just going to read you a little bit of this from the Gospel, from the Bible, Gospel of Luke, chapter 24, verses 13 to 35, if you're interested in following along. Luke 24, 13 to 35. It says this: Now on that same day, 2 of Jesus' followers were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that happened. That's all these things that happened after Jesus had died but then been raised from the tomb. Whilst they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other when you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. One of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know these things that have taken place?" Jesus asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our leaders and chief priests handed him over to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he would be the one to save Israel." Yes, and besides all this, it's now the third day since these things took place. Moreover, some women who were with us astounded us. It was the women folks who encountered the risen Jesus first. So they say, some women who were with us astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find Jesus' body there, they came back and told us that they'd seen a vision of angels who said Jesus was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him. Then the man with them, who was Jesus, said to them, "How foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah, that's Jesus, should suffer these things and enter into glory?" Then he, beginning with the story of Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them all these things that had happened. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he was going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed it and broke it and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" So a story about one of the encounters between Jesus and his followers after he rose from the dead. And the extraordinary thing about that is that these two followers were talking about their huge disappointments after they'd been following Jesus for this period, which we think would probably have been about 3 years. 3 years of their lives they'd been following Jesus. And it seems from what we read in the Bible that most of his followers kind of started with the idea that Jesus was going to be a political leader who was going to start a movement and overthrow the ruling powers in Jerusalem at the time. Save the land. The land was called Israel. Save the nation from the occupying Romans. That seemed to have been the place that a lot of his followers started from. It seemed to be what they were assuming he would do. They thought they were part of a story which was all about them and what they wanted, and all about their land and a political journey to freedom. I mean, that's a pretty big story. But what they didn't realise is they were actually part of a much bigger story, that Jesus was inviting them, by following him, to be part of a story which wasn't just about them, wasn't just about their nation, but in fact was about the whole world. And I love how they were talking and saying that they had hoped that Jesus would be the one to save their country. But actually they were disappointed in that, because Jesus' plan was much bigger, and he'd come to help and save the whole world. So what I want to invite you to do now is to come with me on a little meditation based upon that story. And this is based upon the Road to Emmaus story we've just read. So I'd like to invite you again to get comfortable, to just to be able to imagine the scenes and the places of the time. So maybe to shut your eyes, maybe to take some deep breaths. I'm going to put some background music on, and we'll just try and get ourselves nice and relaxed and go on this meditation together. just shut your eyes as I sing. Maybe take some deep breaths. I'd like you to imagine that you are walking beside a dusty road in the Middle East, perhaps 2,000 years ago, after the great events of the death of Jesus and the mysterious rumours of resurrection and new life. You are walking beside a dusty road. Your feet in their simple leather sandals are hot and tired. Again, the sun is beating down. Though it is towards the end of the day, it is still hot. The dust still rises. The heat is palpable. The sun is in your eyes. You are leaving the city. You are leaving the city, which is the focus of all that happens in that small nation. You are leaving the city because your story has taken an unexpected and difficult turn. For the last 3 years, it's like your life has been building towards something extraordinary. You felt so sure that you knew how things were going to go, only for things to change drastically, right at the moment where you thought your dreams would come true. You have tasted great excitement and euphoria as you have followed this Jesus, but followed by huge disappointment and grief. You have known the highest of hopes, only for those hopes to be so cruelly snatched away at the last minute, as Jesus was nailed to the cross. And your hopes of change, adventure, revolution, joy have faded. As you walk away from the city, you reflect on all that you are leaving behind you. As you walk, I'd like you to imagine that the scene shifts in your eyes. If you can cast your mind back towards the second week of our time together, you see behind you now not the road stretching back to Jerusalem, but the path that you have tread in your life, the shape of your story that you saw in week 2, with twists, with turns, with disappointments, with griefs, with shocks. Perhaps you had a plan. Perhaps there were times when you had the highest of hopes, but had them cruelly snatched away. Perhaps there were times for you when it all made sense, and then all fell apart. Or perhaps you had just got by from one day to another, wondering if there was a plan, if there was any meaning, or if there was any purpose other than just getting by. Just invite you now in your imagination to look back along the road that you've travelled in life, and just gently and safely consider those moments where you have felt disappointment and loss, where your plans, where your big vision for your life has come undone, where your dreams, if you will, as you think about those things, you realise there is a fellow traveller standing next to you on the road. You start to walk together. He greets you and asks what you are thinking about. His face perhaps looks familiar. Perhaps he reminds you of that perfect parent we imagined before. The person walking with you is Jesus, God come to earth. And he says to you, many who followed me had great hopes and plans. They thought that I had come to join in their story, the story of their nation, to fulfill their hopes, to fulfill their dreams. Into God's story, to bring healing and redemption to the whole world. A story where even death brings into mine. You become part of this great plan. You are needed. There are parts in the house of the perfect parent, which only, says Jesus, and can now stretch forward into hope. That path that you have trodden is almost lit up with the light and the love of God. You see it and realise that it is beautiful. It is part of something beautiful, says the voice of Jesus. I can even show you how such things can be brought back to life. You realise that your story can become part of a golden tapestry of stories, all woven together to make the most incredible, vibrant, beautiful pattern you could ever imagine. Tens and hundreds, even thousands of people walking the same path, weaving their stories, joining their stories into God's big story of redemption. God's story of resurrection and hope. Come with me, says Jesus, forever. So thank you for engaging with that reflection, that meditation. The idea of that meditation was to use the story of the encounter on the road to Emmaus to illustrate this idea that actually as we come to bring our stories alongside God's great big story, God's plan for the world, almost like as we thought in the first week, we don't become the centre anymore. God is the centre, God's story is the centre. And because that's the case, we can gather around that with other people. It's almost like we're joined into a new community of people who are all joining together in God's great story of rescue. And as in the story of the road to Emmaus, where they recognised Jesus when he shared the common meal with them, the shared meal with them, with the bread, there's something there of which communion represents to us as Christians, of that shared identity as people who are journeying with God as we share the meal together. So what I want to do now is just look at another piece of the Bible which talks again about this idea of our stories getting bigger, if you will, being joined into something bigger, of the invitation we mentioned at the start of the session, getting bigger again. So the invitation to follow Jesus is an invitation to join our stories into God's bigger story. But that invitation is just bigger and bigger. And as we've already hinted at, for Christians it contains something of eternal hope. Something very much of eternal hope. So if I asked you, for example, another quick question. I asked you what heaven would look like for you. I wonder what answer you'd come up with. You may be tempted to answer with a bit of a joke. Think of the inside, I don't know, of your favourite pub or something like that. Maybe not that. No. But it's an interesting question, is it not? Because it invites us to think about what would be perfect for us. And if we think back to the second and third weeks of the course, I did invite us all to imagine a place of perfect joy and excitement and fun and adventure. And perhaps that's as close as we could get to imagining what heaven would be like to us. Somewhere perfectly good, but vibrant and beautiful and wonderful and exciting, rather than just in popular imagination sitting on a white cloud playing a harp or something. Well, I mention that because I want to think about this little reading from the Bible I'm about to bring to us, which is from the very end of the Bible, one of the very last parts of the Bible, in what's called the book of Revelation, which is a vision, if you will, of a vision of heaven from Revelation 21, and what that says to us, and the invitation that represents. So this is another example of God speaking an invitation to us, and it shows how big and how incredible that invitation is. So Revelation 21 verses 1 to 5, this great mystical vision of heaven says this. The writer, a man called John, says, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'See, the home of God is among people. He will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for the first things have passed away.' And the one who was seated on the throne said, 'See, I am making all things new.'" So that is a vision almost of heaven from the end of the Bible, a vision of the world made right, of a new heaven and a new earth, where every tear is wiped away from our eyes, where death will be no more, and mourning and crying and pain will be no more, and where all things are made new. It's a picture of eternity. It's a picture of eternal hope. It's really important. The idea of eternal hope plays a really important part in Christian spirituality. It really does carry that element of eternal hope. And actually, as much as that's a powerful mystical vision of whatever heaven may be, the Bible doesn't really tell us, or doesn't really give us many pointers as to what awaits us in eternity. But this aspect of believing that death is not the end is very important to Christians. And when God speaks to us, we're invited into a hope that is even bigger than this world. It is actually so big that it somehow includes the idea of going beyond death into eternity, where all things can be made new and where every tear is wiped away from our eyes. Beautiful picture of eternal hope. So we just briefly asked what heaven might be like to us if we imagined it. And what I'd like to do is to bring those two things together, really, and to think about that invitation in perhaps a more concrete way. So what I'd like you to do for a moment, if you with me would be willing to, is just engage with another meditation. I'll put some music on for a moment, not quite as long this time. And again, just to get yourselves comfortable, if you can. Just to relax again. Maybe just to think in in your mind's eye, if you can, about what heaven would be to you. To imagine, if you will, things that you have lost. Maybe those dreams that have died. And hear the God of resurrection saying to you, He will wipe every tear from your eyes, and that all things will be made new. I want you to imagine, if you will, hearing the voice of the perfect parent invite you into a vision of eternal hope, invite you to receive eternal hope. It's hard to imagine heaven, I think, is it not? So I'd like you to dare to imagine, just for a moment, something more concrete, something nearer to home. This may sound a little odd, but what if we imagined our city, wherever we live, our town, as made perfect, as made heavenly, perfectly good, perhaps. Not monochrome and dull, but vibrant and full of joy. I wonder what that would look like in your mind's eye. Just take a moment to imagine that, if you will. Your city, your town, with all the wrongs made right. What would that be like? Perhaps think of some of the sights you saw last time you were in your town or your city. Perhaps think about some of the people you saw who were sleeping rough. Whose faces had the stories and the lines of pain in them. Perhaps imagine those faces transformed. Everyone having what they need. Everyone having a place. Everyone having recognition, status, if you will. Everyone having what they need. I wonder what your street would be like, made right, made perfect. I wonder what you would imagine. What would that be like for you? Wrongs righted. Tears wiped away. Things made new. What would your house be like? Made perfect. Wrongs righted. Tears wiped away. Things made new. To imagine, if you will, the people you know on your street, in your town, weaving their stories together, joining their stories together into a beautiful tapestry, a community of mutual love, care and support. where everyone is valued and everyone is loved. I'd like you to imagine, if you will, that the voice of love, the voice of the perfect parent, speaks to you and says to you, this is the big story that you are invited to become part of. This is my invitation to you, to be part of making this happen, to journey towards this picture of the world made right, to live with eternal hope, to be part of something so much bigger than yourself, to accept the biggest invitation of all. So thank you again for engaging with that meditation. Really, we're coming close to answering the question, in some respects, that we posed at the start of why communion is this symbolic shared meal of bread and wine, represented here. Why this meal is such an important part of Christian spirituality, or why Christians use it and celebrate it and enjoy it. Well, simply because communion is a shared meal that for Christians represents our acceptance of that invitation to journey with God into that place of eternal hope and that place of love and joy and peace. It represents our acceptance of our part in that story, of our part to try and make the world heavenly, if you will, to make the world the way it should be. And it is a shared meal. Shared meals have always been important and powerful things, and still are. And we probably miss shared meals with friends and family at the moment, don't we, in this current lockdown time. And there's something about sharing the bread and the wine together for Christians which helps us understand that we are united as one community who love each other, ideally, and who have accepted that invitation into love, joy and peace. And we also share the meal of communion simply because Jesus told his followers to do this, to remember him. And he said that during the famous Last Supper, the last meal with his followers before he was arrested and sent to the cross. So communion, as I say, is that symbol of joining in with the biggest story of all, a symbol of all our stories being redefined as we join in with God's big story, but also a symbol of the possibility of resurrection for ourselves, for our hopes and dreams, a symbol of eternity as we remember the story of Jesus who died and we believe was raised. So communion, I suppose you could say, is a meal that joins stories, a meal that redefines stories. You could almost say it's a physical, wide-awake meditation on our stories being made new, on being joined together into a community with other people. It is a symbol of our being part of something bigger and something eternal. So hopefully that helps you see a little bit of why the shared meal of communion, the symbolic meal, is so important to Christians. It does indeed represent our acceptance of that great invitation, the biggest invitation we could ever have to journey with God into eternal hope and to love, joy and peace. So really that we come to this point, we come towards the end of our time together. And what I would do at this point, if we were gathered together, is we would share a simple shared meal together, maybe of some bread and some wine. Like communion, we wouldn't actually do communion as it's done in Christian worship. but we would do a simple shared meal as a sign of a similar sort of thing, as a sign of the relationships we formed with each other, as a sign of our shared respect and love, and maybe even for you as a sign of journeying with God into love, joy and peace. So I'm going to take a little sip of this wine now and a little bite of this bread after praying through a little prayer which I've got here. And what I want to invite you to do, I don't know if you've got anything nearby that you can eat, even if it's a chocolate biscuit, but if we share a simple meal together, even with our imagination, as we can't share it together in person, I would like to invite you that as you take a bite of whatever it is, even, as I say, imaginatively, as you take a sip of something, even if it's a cup of tea, or even if it's just imaginatively, that you'll be receiving, or ask God that as you do that you will receive a bit of what it is that you need for this moment, for this day, for this time, to help you journey on into love, joy and peace. The premise of this session, of these sessions we've had, all based upon, as I say, if you remember from the very first week, one of the first Christian leaders who wrote a letter to one of the first Christian churches, a guy called, well, we know him now as St. Paul, who wrote about the fruit of the spiritual life, the fruit of the Spirit, he called it, the fruit of the spiritual journey with God. And he wrote about the fruit of that journey being love, joy, peace, and qualities on love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Obviously, the course name, Love, Joy, Peace, comes from the first three of those. So I want to pray now that as we take a sip and bite of our shared meal, that you can receive from God which one of those it is that you need this evening. Even now, some love, some joy, some peace, maybe some of those qualities that I briefly mentioned, other fruits of the spiritual journey, patience, goodness, kindness, faithfulness, self-control even. So that's my prayer. So I want to pray that now, and then just pray a little prayer over this little shared meal. And we'll take a bite together, as I say, in our imagination, if nothing else. If you've got a chocolate biscuit and a cup of tea nearby, then take a bite or a sip of that. And we'll share this meal together, separate though we are. So God, we do pray that you would speak to us, all of us individuals, that you will invite us to join with you, to join our stories into a bigger story, a greater story, a bigger imagination than we've ever heard, ever imagined. An imagination to journey on with you forever into love, joy and peace, even into eternity. An invitation to have all made new in us. An invitation to be part of making this world the way it should be, of making it heavenly. As we imagine our homes and our streets and our towns made right, may you help us to be part of making them so, of making them right. We pray now that you will give us the gifts we need this day, a sign of your love and your care for us. May we receive as we eat this shared meal some love, some joy, some peace, whatever it is that we ask for now. So this bread is a sign of God's goodness, a sign of God's care, a sign that God loves us, a sign that God is here, a sign of God's invitation to us all. As we share it, it becomes a sign of God's provision, God's abundance, that there is always more to discover, that as we share, so we receive back more than we've given. This bread helps us to remember that you, Jesus, came to be with ordinary people in an ordinary place, that you ate with them, that you shared their joys and their sorrows. This bread and this wine help us remember that you are the bread of life. As food gives strength to our bodies, so you give strength to our hearts and life to our souls. So as we share this bread and this wine, this shared meal together. Help us remember that you gave your life for us. That as we eat together, help us hear your invitation to join our stories into your great story of rescue and redemption. Help us hear your invitation into eternity, to adventure, into love, joy, and peace. Amen. Amen. So I'm going to eat a piece of this. So, dear God, do give us that which you long to give us, love, joy, and peace. Amen. So I just want to finish by reading some words about invitation, words which sum up our 5 weeks together we've had. And then I'll say thank you very much and see you soon. I'll remind you that we've got online worship only for the next few weeks at St Paul's, our community of St Paul's. We've got evening prayer at 7 p.m. on Monday, Wednesday and Friday. And we've got our worship online at 10 a.m. on Sunday. And it's going to alternate between being formal and informal. So next week we've got a formal service of remembrance at 10 a.m. online. The week after that we've got an informal service and so on and so forth. So let me speak these words of invitation to us, these words that sum up our journey over the last 5 weeks, and let me thank you for being part of it. Thank you very much. So you are invited. You are invited into love, joy and peace. You are invited to receive the love of God, the love that the perfect parent has for you. To see yourself through the loving eyes of the one who created you. You are invited into the joy of journeying with God towards an exciting and wonderful destination. Into the joy of knowing that God has a plan for your life. You are invited into peace with your story and journey so far, to see that your unique journey can be used by God to unlock unique blessings for yourself and others. You are invited into redemption, into healing and wholeness. You are invited into silence that never has to be feared. That means you never have to be alone because of the extraordinary gift of Jesus on the cross. You are invited to hear how your story is redefined by God and made part of a much bigger story. You are invited to join your story into the biggest story of all, God's great story of rescue and redemption for all the world. You are invited to imagine the world the way it should be and to make it happen. You are invited into adventure and purpose. You are invited into community. You are invited into heaven, eternity, even an eternity of love, joy, and peace.